At a funeral, a millionaire meets a black girl with a matching birthmark, shocking the family. What hidden connection will this mark reveal about their shared history? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The marble halls of the Anderson mansion echoed with hushed whispers as New York's elite gathered for Richard Anderson's funeral. The grand foyer, with its crystal chandeliers and centuries-old portraits, served as a stark reminder of the family's long-standing prominence in society. Dark suits and black dresses moved like shadows across the polished floors, while servants carried silver trays of refreshments among the mourners. Through the tall windows, late afternoon light cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the tense atmosphere among the guests. Small groups formed and reformed, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever a member of the Anderson family passed by. The recent controversies surrounding the family's business dealings had given the social circles plenty to discuss, though none dared to mention them openly during the funeral. In one corner, Margaret Wellington, a longtime family friend, spoke in hushed tones to her circle of confidants. "The Anderson name isn't what it used to be," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "First the merger scandal, and now this unfortunate business with the offshore accounts." Her companions nodded in agreement, their eyes darting around to ensure no Anderson was within earshot. Charles Anderson stood alone by the fireplace, his tall frame rigid in his perfectly tailored black suit. At 35, he had already achieved considerable success in his own right, separate from the family business, but today he felt like an outsider in his own home. He observed the gathering with a detached interest, noting how the other mourners seemed to give him a wide berth. The weight of the Anderson name felt particularly heavy today. The room was divided into clear social hierarchies. The old money families clustered near the library entrance, while the newer additions to their social circle maintained a respectful distance. The service staff moved efficiently through the spaces between, nearly invisible to the gathered mourners. Charles watched this careful dance of social status with growing discomfort. His attention was drawn to an unfamiliar face in the crowd. A young woman in a simple black dress stood near the window, somewhat apart from the other guests. Unlike the rest of the mourners who seemed to be performing their grief, her sadness appeared genuine. Charles noticed how she stood with quiet dignity, seemingly unaware of the sideways glances she received from some of the other guests. The woman was Leah Johnson, though Charles didn't know her name yet. She had come to pay respects to James, her friend who had worked as Uncle Richard's personal assistant for years. Her presence at the funeral had raised eyebrows among the traditional Anderson social circle, but Uncle Richard had specifically mentioned in his will that his staff should be welcomed at the service. As Charles observed her, something about her bearing caught his attention. She carried herself with a natural grace that seemed to defy the obvious discomfort of some of the other guests at her presence. When she turned slightly, catching the late afternoon light, Charles felt an inexplicable pull to move closer. The crowd shifted, creating a momentary clear path between them. Their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade away. Charles felt a jolt of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met before. There was something in her eyes that spoke of a deeper understanding, a shared experience he couldn't quite name. Just then, his mother Eleanor appeared at his side, her hand gripping his arm with subtle urgency. "Charles, dear, the minister would like to speak with you about tea." He reading of the will. Her voice was low but commanding, a skill she had perfected over years of social orchestration. Charles noticed how her eyes flicked briefly toward Leah before returning to him, a slight frown creasing her forehead. As Charles allowed himself to be led away, he glanced back over his shoulder. Leah had moved closer to where he had been standing, and as she lifted her hand to brush away a strand of hair, he saw it, a distinctive mark on her wrist, identical to the one he had carried since birth. The sight stopped him in his tracks, causing his mother to tug at his arm with more insistence. The revelation left him shaken, but the pressing duties of the funeral forced him to continue his role as the dutiful Anderson son. Throughout the remainder of the service, he found his attention repeatedly drawn to Leah, questions forming in his mind that he knew would be dangerous to ask in front of his family. The tension in the room seemed to crescendo as the minister began the final prayers. Charles could feel the weight of generations of Anderson expectations pressing down on him, even as his mind raced with questions about the woman with the matching mark. The carefully maintained facade of Anderson family unity began to feel like it might crack at any moment, revealing the complexities and secrets that lay beneath. The days following Uncle Richard's funeral left Charles restless in his Manhattan penthouse. He sat at his desk, surrounded by old family albums and documents he'd retrieved from the mansion's library. The mark on his wrist, a distinctive pattern resembling intertwined branches, had never seemed more significant. For years, his mother had dismissed it as a simple birthmark, but the identical mark on Leah's wrist challenged everything he thought he knew about his family. Charles began his investigation methodically, starting with the oldest family records he could access. The Anderson family pride in documentation proved useful. They had maintained detailed genealogical records dating back to their arrival in New York in the 1850s. He noticed something peculiar. While birth records were meticulously kept, there were occasional gaps in the family tree, carefully obscured by vague references to travel abroad or extended business ventures. In his family's Fifth Avenue office, Charles made discreet inquiries about past employees, particularly focusing on the years around his birth. The older staff members became noticeably uncomfortable when he asked about certain periods, their eyes darting away as they made excuses to leave the room. One elderly secretary, Mrs. Patterson, who had worked for the family for over 40 years, paused longer than necessary when he mentioned birthmarks. Her hesitation spoke volumes, but she quickly composed herself and claimed ignorance. Meanwhile, across the city in a modest apartment in Harlem, Leah Johnson sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by her own collection of family memories. Her mother, Diana, had always been meticulous about preserving their history, keeping photographs, letters, and documents in carefully labeled boxes. Leah had never paid much attention to these archives before, but now they seemed to hold vital importance. She found herself drawn to a particular photograph from the 1980s, showing her grandmother standing in front of the Anderson mansion. The photograph was worn around the edges, but her grandmother's proud stance was clear. According to the note on the back, she had worked in the mansion as part of the household staff. Leah had never known this detail about her family history, and it sparked more questions than answers. Diana watched her daughter's investigation from the kitchen doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. She had always told Leah that their family story was complex, but now she wondered if she should have shared more. The mark on Leah's wrist, which she had always claimed came from our father's side, suddenly felt like a weight pulling them toward a truth she had hoped to avoid. The breakthrough came when Charles and Leah arranged to meet at a small cafe in Greenwich Village, away from the prying eyes of both their social circles. The cafe's discreet corner booth provided privacy as they spread their findings on the table between them. Charles had brought copies of Anderson family photographs, while Leah shared what she had discovered in her mother's archives. As they compared notes, patterns began to emerge. Both families had connections to the Anderson mansion during the same periods. There were overlapping dates, shared locations, and most intriguingly, mentions of a specific household staff member who had worked for the family for decades, but whose name had been carefully erased from official records. Their hands brushed accidentally as they reached for the same photograph, and both noticed how their matching marks seemed to align perfectly. The cafe's warm lighting highlighted the identical patterns on their wrists, making the connection between them feel even more significant. Charles found himself studying Leah's features, noticing subtle similarities to faces in his family albums that he had never paid attention to before. The weight of their discoveries hung heavy in the air between them. Charles shared stories of growing up in the Anderson mansion, of the pressure to maintain appearances and uphold family traditions. Leah spoke of her mother's determination to give her every opportunity, of the challenges they faced, and of the stories her grandmother used to tell about working for wealthy families in Manhattan. As their coffee grew cold, they realized their conversation had lasted hours. The cafe had nearly emptied, but neither was ready to leave. Their shared mark had brought them together, but it was the mystery surrounding their families that kept them talking. Both sensed that they had barely scratched the surface of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their identities. The Anderson mansion's attic stretched beneath centuries-old rafters, filled with generations of family history stored in dusty trunks and boxes. Charles led Leah through the maze of forgotten furniture and covered paintings, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The space felt frozen in time, preserving secrets beneath layers of dust and shadow. Charles had convinced the housekeeper to grant them access by claiming he needed to review old business documents. They began their search methodically, working through sections of the attic that corresponded to the time periods they had identified in their research. The air was thick with dust, causing Leah to sneeze occasionally as they shifted through old papers and photographs. A breakthrough came when Charles discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in an old wardrobe. The space contained a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, but still intact. The diary belonged to Elizabeth Anderson, Charles's great-great-aunt, dated 1920. As they carefully opened the fragile pages, both noticed how their matching birthmarks seemed to tingle, as if responding to the proximity of answers they had been seeking. The diary's entries began innocently enough, describing the social seasons and family obligations typical of the Anderson family. However, as they read deeper, the tone changed. Elizabeth wrote of secret meetings in the mansion's garden with a woman named Rose, who worked as a seamstress for the household. The entries became more passionate and personal, describing a deep connection that transcended the rigid social boundaries of their time. Charles read aloud from one particularly moving entry. Rose's presence brings light to these dark halls. When we are together, the weight of family expectations falls away, and I see the world as it truly is, full of possibility and love that knows no boundaries. The mark we share feels like a blessing, a sign that our connection was meant to be, despite what society demands. Leah's hands trembled as she touched the pages. The description of the mark matched their own exactly. Elizabeth had drawn a small sketch of it in the margin of one page, the same intertwined pattern that both Charles and Leah carried on their wrists. The diary revealed that Rose also bore this mark, and Elizabeth believed it to be a symbol of their destined connection. As they continued reading, the stakes became clear. Elizabeth wrote of growing pressure from her family to marry a suitable match from their social circle. Rose faced increasing scrutiny from other staff members who suspected the nature of their relationship. The entries became more desperate, filled with plans for secret meetings and fears of discovery. The sound of footsteps on the stairs startled them both. Charles quickly returned the diary to its hiding place, making note of its exact location. They barely managed to move away from the wardrobe before Charles's mother Eleanor appeared at the attic entrance, her expression a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "Charles? What are you doing up here?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she noticed Leah, her posture stiffening noticeably. "And with company?" The way she said the last word carried volumes of unspoken judgment. Charles smoothly explained they were researching family history for a potential business project, but Eleanor's expression made it clear she wasn't convinced. The tension in the air grew thick as Eleanor's gaze fixed on Leah's wrist, where her sleeve had pulled back to reveal the distinctive mark. After Eleanor left, insisting that Charles attend an urgent family meeting, Leah and Charles shared a knowing look. The diary had confirmed their suspicions about a connection between their families, but it had also revealed the dangers of pursuing the truth. The pressure that had forced Elizabeth and Rose apart still existed in different forms today. Word of their attic exploration spread quickly through the Anderson family circle. Within days, Charles noticed increased scrutiny from family members. At social events, whispers followed him, and business associates began asking pointed questions about his recent activities. The careful facade of Anderson family unity showed signs of cracking under the strain of potential scandal. The Anderson family conference room, with its imposing mahogany table and leather chairs, became the stage for a confrontation Charles had been dreading. His mother Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her perfect posture and carefully controlled expression masking the fury in her eyes. The Manhattan skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows served as a reminder of everything the Anderson family had built and everything they stood to lose. "You need to understand the gravity of what you're doing, Charles," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of generations of carefully maintained social standing. "This investigation of yours has caught the attention of the board members. They're concerned about the stability of the family's leadership." She placed a manila folder on the table between them, filled with photographs of his meetings with Leah, including their cafe conversation and their time at the mansion. Charles felt his jaw tighten as he realized the extent of his family's surveillance. The mark on his wrist seemed to burn as he reached for the folder, examining the detailed documentation of his every move over the past weeks. The investigator had been thorough, including background information on Leah's family that painted them in a deliberately unfavorable light. Meanwhile, across town, Leah faced her own battles. At the community center where she taught music, whispers followed her through the hallways. Her colleagues, once friendly and supportive, now viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The pressure came from unexpected direction. Even her childhood friend, Marcus, confronted her after class. "You're being used, Leah," Marcus insisted, his concern evident in his voice. "The Andersons, they're not our people. They'll never accept you as anything more than a curiosity, a scandal they need to contain." His words echoed the sentiments she'd heard from others in her community, who saw her connection with Charles as a betrayal of their shared struggles. The situation intensified when Thomas Richmond, CEO of Richmond Industries and the Andersons' longtime business rival, began making public appearances with thinly veiled references to the Anderson family's hidden history. At a charity gala, Richmond cornered Charles near the bar, his friendly smile failing to mask the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Fascinating things, family secrets," Richmond mused, swirling his scotch. "They have a way of emerging at the most inconvenient times. I've always admired how your family maintained its image of perfection. It would be a shame if that image were to be tarnished." The threat in his words was clear. He knew something, and he was prepared to use it. The pressure reached a breaking point when Eleanor received an anonymous envelope containing historical documents that suggested a pattern of similar incidents in the Anderson family history. The papers detailed other instances of marks appearing across racial and social boundaries, each case carefully buried under layers of money and influence. Charles found himself increasingly isolated within his own family. His father, William Anderson, refused to meet his eyes during board meetings. His sister Caroline, once his closest confidant, began declining his calls. The family's legal team worked overtime to contain any possible leaks, while their PR firm prepared statements for various scenarios. Leah experienced similar isolation, but from a different angle. Her mother's friends, who had watched her grow up, now spoke about her in hushed, disapproving tones. The community that had always been her support system began to fragment, with some defending her right to pursue the truth while others saw her actions as disruptive to their careful progress in society. The pressure culminated in a new revelation. A journalist from the New York Times had begun asking questions about unusual patterns in the Anderson family's historical employment records. The possibility of a major newspaper investigation sent shockwaves through the family's inner circle, leading to emergency meetings and hurried consultations with crisis management experts. The New York Public Library became Charles and Leah's sanctuary, its grand reading room offering both privacy and resources for their deepening investigation. They spent hours poring over historical records, city directories, and newspaper archives from the 1920s. The massive wooden tables, illuminated by brass reading lamps, held their growing collection of evidence about the connection between their families. Through meticulous research, they discovered that Rose, the woman from Elizabeth's diary, had lived in a small house in what was then called the Tenderloin District. City records showed she had operated a successful dressmaking business, with several wealthy clients, including the Andersons. More significantly, they found birth records indicating Rose had a child in 1922, though the father's name was conspicuously absent from the documentation. Their breakthrough came in the form of a letter, preserved in the library's special collections. Written by Elizabeth Anderson to her personal lawyer, it detailed specific instructions for a trust fund to be established for Rose's child. The letter had never been delivered, instead finding its way into the library's archives through a donation of legal papers. The trust fund, if it existed, would provide definitive proof of the Anderson family's connection to Rose's lineage. As Charles photographed the letter with trembling hands, Leah N. Odicked a familiar name among the witnesses listed: Margaret Richmond, Thomas Richmond's grandmother. This discovery explained Richmond's recent interest in the Anderson family's affairs. His family had been keeping this secret for generations, waiting for the perfect moment to use it. The pair rushed back to the Anderson mansion, armed with their findings. In the family's private study, they located an old safe behind a painting, a location mentioned in Elizabeth's diary. Using the combination hinted at in Elizabeth's letter, they found the original trust documents inside, along with a collection of letters between Elizabeth and Rose that spanned several years. Just as they were examining these documents, Charles's father William burst into the study, his face red with barely contained rage. Behind him stood Eleanor, clutching a manila envelope identical to the one that had contained the surveillance photos of Charles and Leah. The confrontation that followed was explosive, with William demanding the immediate surrender of all documents they had discovered. "You have no idea what you're threatening to destroy," William thundered, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "This family's reputation, its position in society, the livelihoods of hundreds of employees, all of it rests on the foundation of our name. And you're willing to risk it all for what? Some misguided sense of historical justice." Charles stood his ground, the mark on his wrist visible as he gripped the trust documents. "This isn't about destroying anything, Father. It's about understanding who we really are. The mark Leah and I share isn't a coincidence. It's a sign that this family's true history needs to be acknowledged." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice softer but no less intense. "Charles, darling, think about what you're doing. Thomas Richmond has already begun making inquiries with the board. If this gets out, the damage won't just be social, it will be financial. The company's stock has already started to fluctuate based on rumors alone." Leah, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "Mrs. Anderson, this isn't about damage or scandal. It's about truth and family, something I thought the Andersons valued above all else. These documents show that Elizabeth understood that. She tried to protect both her family's legacy and the truth of her relationship with Rose." Diana Johnson sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea, as Leah confronted her with the evidence they'd discovered. The small apartment felt even more cramped under the weight of decades of unspoken truths. Family photos on the walls seemed to watch their conversation, generations of faces holding their own secrets. "I always knew this day would come," Diana said, her voice heavy with resignation. She stood and walked to an old chest in the corner of the living room, one Leah had seen countless times but never thought to question. From its depths, Diana retrieved a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. "Your grandmother made me promise to give this to you only when the time was right. When you started asking questions about the mark, I knew that time was approaching." Inside the box lay a collection of letters, photographs, and a small journal. The items told a story that paralleled Elizabeth and Rose's. Diana's mother had worked as a housekeeper for the Andersons in the 1960s, during which time she witnessed another instance of the mark appearing across family lines. She had documented everything, understanding its significance, but keeping the information hidden to protect both families. Meanwhile, Charles isolated himself in his downtown apartment, overwhelmed by the weight of his family's expectations and the magnitude of what he and Leah had discovered. The Anderson family's influence had begun to affect his professional life. Clients mysteriously canceled meetings, investments fell through, and his fully built independent career showed signs of crumbling. In a moment of fear and doubt, Charles made a decision that would haunt him. He sent Leah a carefully worded email, explaining that they needed to stop their investigation. His words, though polite, carried the unmistakable chill of retreat. "It's become clear that pursuing this further will only cause pain to both our families. Some truths are better left in the past. I'm sorry." The impact of Charles's withdrawal hit Leah hard. She had expected resistance from others, but his abandonment felt like a personal betrayal. The mark on her wrist, once a source of curiosity and connection, now felt like a brand of naive optimism. She threw herself into understanding her mother's revelations, determined to uncover the truth with or without Charles's help. Diana watched her daughter's pain with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. She revealed that she had her own reasons for keeping quiet all these years. In the 1980s, when she discovered the truth about the Marks and their family's connection to the Andersons, she had been offered a choice: silence in exchange for Leah's education being quietly funded through a scholarship program. "I chose your future over the truth," Diana admitted, tears in her eyes. "Maybe it was wrong, but watching you grow up with opportunities one never had, I told myself it was worth the price of silence. But now I see that the price was higher than I thought. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard." Leah's confrontation with her mother brought clarity, but also new questions. The pattern of marks appearing throughout generations, always connecting the Anderson family with individuals from different social and racial backgrounds, suggested something more profound than coincidence. Each instance had been carefully hidden, the truth buried under layers of privilege and power. Charles, in his self-imposed isolation, found himself unable to sleep, haunted by the faces in the old photographs and the weight of generations of suppressed truths. His apartment, once a symbol of his independence from family influence, now felt like a gilded cage. Each night, he found himself staring at his mark, knowing that somewhere across the city, Leah was probably doing the same. The annual Anderson Foundation Gala transformed the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Temple of Dender into a glittering showcase of New York's elite. Charles stood among the crowd, making mechanical small talk while his mind wandered to Leah. The past week of separation had felt like an eternity, each day weighted with regret. The endless champagne flutes and practiced smiles couldn't mask the hollow feeling in his chest. The evening took an unexpected turn when Leah entered the gallery. She hadn't planned to attend, but her position as a music teacher at a foundation-funded community center had earned her an invitation. She wore a deep blue gown that made her stand out among the sea of traditional black evening wear. The mark on her wrist remained visible, a silent statement of defiance against those who wished to keep her hidden. The reaction to her arrival rippled through the crowd. Eleanor Anderson's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips, while Thomas Richmond watched the scene unfold with poorly concealed satisfaction. The string quartet's music seemed to fade as conversations hushed, then resumed with increased intensity. Charles felt the familiar pull toward her, stronger now after their time apart. Their eyes met across the gallery, the ancient Egyptian temple stones bearing witness to their silent exchange. Charles started to move toward her, but found his path blocked by a group of board members strategically positioning themselves between them. He watched as Leah navigated the crowd with grace, accepting both the obvious snubs and false pleasantries with equal dignity. When they finally found themselves near each other by the temple's reflecting pool, the tension was palpable. The mark on Charles's wrist seemed to pulse in recognition of its twin. "Leah, he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Save your apologies, Charles," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "My mother told me everything. About the scholarship, about the generations of silence, about how your family has perfected the art of making problems disappear. I'm not here for reconciliation. I'm here because running away from the truth makes us complicit in their lies." The weight of her words hit Charles like a physical blow. Around them, the gala continued, but they existed in their own bubble of painful honesty. He noticed how other guests watched them while pretending not to, phones discreetly recording their interaction for the society gossip channels. "I was wrong," Charles admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walking away was easier than facing what we discovered. But every night since then, I've looked at this mark and felt the weight of generations of cowardice. We owe them more than silence. Elizabeth, Rose, your grandmother, all of them." Before Leah could respond, her mother Diana appeared beside them. She had been invited last minute by the Foundation's Diversity Committee, an obvious attempt to appear progressive while maintaining old barriers. Diana looked between her daughter and Charles, seeing the pain and longing in their expressions. "The truth has been buried for too long," Diana said, her voice carrying quiet authority. Each generation thought they were protecting the next by keeping silent. But protection without progress is just another form of prison. Her words seemed to echo off the ancient stones, carrying the wisdom of years spent watching from the shadows. The evening ended with Leah leaving alone, but the seeds of reconciliation had been planted. Charles watched her go, understanding that his moment of weakness had cost him her trust, but perhaps not irrevocably. The mark they shared had brought them together twice now, first by chance and now by choice. The Anderson family's corporate headquarters buzzed with nervous energy as rumors of a hostile takeover attempt by Richmond Industries circulated through the halls. Charles sat through an emergency board meeting, watching his father William pace before the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Manhattan's financial district. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room table, where satellite phones and tablets displayed real-time stock market data showing troubling patterns in Anderson Holdings share prices. Thomas Richmond had begun making strategic moves, acquiring smaller companies that held crucial contracts with Anderson Holdings. Each acquisition tightened the noose around the family business, threatening decades of carefully cultivated business relationships. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs as William presented the latest financial projections, which showed a concerning downward trend. Eleanor Anderson organized an emergency family council meeting in the mansion's private library. The wood-paneled room, typically a sanctuary of family history, now felt like a war room. Portraits of Anderson patriarchs seemed to judge their descendants' handling of the crisis from their gilt frames. Charles noticed how his mother's usually steady hands trembled slightly as she presented a thick folder of documents, evidence that Richmond had been systematically collecting information about the Anderson family's historical indiscretions. "They're not just after the company," Eleanor explained, her voice tense. "Richmond wants to destroy our legacy. He's been gathering stories from former staff members, tracking down descendants of household employees, building a narrative that could devastate everything we've built." Her eyes fixed on Charles as she spoke, making it clear that his investigation with Leah had provided Richmond with the opening he needed. The situation escalated when Richmond Industries announced a press conference scheduled for the following week. The announcement sent shockwaves through New York's business community, with speculation running rampant about potential revelations. The Anderson family's PR team worked overtime, trying to prepare for every possible scenario while maintaining a facade of calm confidence. Charles received an anonymous text message during a late-night strategy session. It contained details about a private meeting between Richmond and several key Anderson Holdings shareholders, scheduled for the following evening at Richmond's private club. The message came from an unknown number, but the signature at the end, a simple drawn mark matching the one on his wrist, told him everything he needed to know about its source. The knowledge of this secret meeting created a moral dilemma for Charles. Sharing the information with his family would mean betraying Leah's trust once again, but keeping it to himself could result in the destruction of his family's company and the livelihoods of thousands of employees. The mark on his wrist seemed to burn as he wrestled with the decision. William noticed his son's distraction during their morning briefing with the legal team. "You know something," he stated rather than asked, his voice carrying decades of authority. "Whatever it is, Charles, remember where your loyalties should lie." The emphasis on should hung heavy in the air between them, a reminder of the expectations that had shaped Charles's entire life. Leah's infiltration of the Richmond meeting required careful planning. She used her connection to the Anderson Foundation's arts program to gain access to Richmond's private club, where she posed as part of the evening's entertainment staff. The club's dark wood paneling and leather furniture created shadows perfect for concealment as she positioned herself near the private dining room where the meeting would take place. Richmond had gathered 7 key Anderson Holdings shareholders, each representing significant voting power on the board. Through the partially open door, Leah could hear Richmond's smooth voice as he presented his case. He spoke of modernizing the company, of breaking free from outdated family control, but beneath his corporate jargon lay a deeper agenda. When he began discussing the historical documentation he had gathered, Leah felt her heart race. Charles arrived at the club just as Richmond was reaching the crucial part of his presentation. He had decided that protecting his family's legacy couldn't come at the cost of his integrity. Not again. As he approached the private dining room, he saw Leah hidden in an alcove. Their eyes met, and without words, they formed an alliance. The mark they shared seemed to pulse with shared purpose. Richmond's voice carried clearly through the door. The Anderson family's carefully constructed image hides generations of secrets. I have proof of multiple instances where they've buried evidence of their own mixed-race descendants, paid for silence, and manipulated records. Their supposed moral authority is built on a foundation of lies. Charles chose this moment to make his entrance, with Leah stepping out of the shadows beside him. The shareholders' faces registered shock at this interruption, but Richmond's expression showed something else: recognition. The way his eyes fixed on their matching marks revealed a truth neither Charles nor Leah had anticipated. "You're not telling the whole story, are you, Thomas?" Charles challenged. "The mark Leah and I share. You've seen it before, haven't you?" The tension in the room crystallized as Richmond's composure cracked slightly. He unconsciously touched his collar, as if ensuring it covered his neck completely. Leah stepped forward, her voice steady. "Your grandmother Margaret wasn't just a witness to Elizabeth and Rose's story. She had her own secret, didn't she? That's why your family has been obsessed with the Andersons for generations. You're not just a business rival, you're family." Richmond's face drained of color as Charles produced Elizabeth's diary from his jacket. "Your grandmother's name appears too often in these pages to be coincidence. She wasn't just keeping Elizabeth's secret, she was keeping her own. The mark doesn't just appear in the Anderson line, does it? It appears whenever the artificial barriers between families begin to break down." The revelation stunned the shareholders into silence. Richmond's carefully orchestrated takedown had transformed into something more personal and profound. One elderly board member stood up, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a faded but familiar mark. "I've carried this for 70 years, he said quietly. "My mother worked as a cook for the Andersons in the 1950s. I never knew. I thought I was the only one." The series of revelations cascaded through the room. The story Richmond had planned to use as a weapon against the Andersons had transformed into something more significant, evidence of a deeper connection that transcended family rivalries and social boundaries. The mark they shared wasn't a symbol of shame or scandal. It was a testament to the artificial nature of the barriers society had constructed. The Anderson Mansion's grand ballroom hosted an unprecedented press conference, its crystal chandeliers illuminating a scene that would reshape multiple family legacies. Charles and Leah stood together at the podium, their matching marks visible to the assembled journalists, photographers, and social media influencers. Behind them sat representatives from both the Anderson and Richmond families, their presence a testament to the magnitude of the moment. Charles spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of generations of hidden truths. "The story we're about to share isn't just about the Anderson family or the Richmonds, or even about the marks that have appeared throughout our generations. It's about the artificial barriers we create and the price we pay to maintain them." He gestured to the assembled family members, each one revealing their own mark, some faded with age, others still vivid, each telling its own story of connection across manufactured divides. The revelation that followed transformed what could have been a scandal into something more profound. Through careful research, Leah had discovered that the woman from Elizabeth's diary, Rose, had played a crucial role in raising Charles's father, William. Rose had remained in the Anderson household as a trusted servant, secretly watching over her own grandson while maintaining the facade of being merely a devoted employee. Diana Johnson stepped forward, sharing her own discovery. The marks appeared not as a brand of shame, but as a symbol of resilience. Throughout generations, they had manifested whenever love and human connection threatened to overcome society's artificial boundaries. The mark was not just a genetic quirk, but a physical manifestation of humanity's innate resistance to arbitrary division. Thomas Richmond, humbled by the evidence of his own family's connection to this legacy, abandoned his hostile takeover attempt. Instead, he proposed a merger of a different kind, a joint foundation dedicated to uncovering and preserving similar stories of connection across social divides. The mark they shared became not a source of scandal but a symbol of pride, a reminder that human bonds transcend the barriers we construct. The assembled journalists watched in amazement as family after family came forward, sharing their own stories of marks and hidden connections. The narrative shifted from one of scandal to one of revelation and reconciliation. Eleanor Anderson, who had fought so hard to maintain the old order, found herself moved by the strength of these combined histories. In a final, powerful moment, Leah revealed the deepest truth they had discovered, the true connection between her family and Teach. E. Andersons went beyond the story in Elizabeth's diary. Rose had been more than just a servant or a secret love. She had been a cornerstone of the Anderson family's success, her wisdom and strength silently guiding generations while her own legacy remained hidden in the shadows. The press conference ended not with scandal, but with hope. The Anderson and Richmond families, along with others who shared their mark, established a trust dedicated to preserving and sharing stories of connection across social boundaries. The mark they once hid became a symbol of pride, a reminder that love and human connection inevitably find ways to bridge the divisions we create. Charles and Leah's story became not just a tale of romance, but a catalyst for change in New York's social landscape. Their marks, once hidden beneath sleeves and collars, became visible symbols of a new kind of legacy, one built on truth, acceptance, and the recognition that the strongest family trees are those with branches that reach across every divide. The ending brought full circle the themes of identity, acceptance, and the artificial nature of social barriers, while providing resolution to both the personal and societal conflicts presented throughout the narrative.